All right, and we are back. Let me pin this comment to say follow at project underscore Scovid for more info on sickle cell disease and COVID-19 vaccines. Alrighty. I'm going to post that. I'm going to pin my comment here. All right, and we are back. We were having some technical difficulties earlier, but I think we figured them out. And today we are going to be talking with Dr. Rhea Boyd. Oh, I'm sorry that you're in the hospital. I hope you feel better soon, and I hope you get the hydration you need. So we're going to be joined by Dr. Rhea Boyd. She is a pediatrician and a public health advocate, and she has been working to help educate the Black and Brown communities about the COVID-19 vaccine. And so the goal here is to just get some information so that people with sickle cell disease and their families can make educated choices, can make decisions, can feel empowered to receive the COVID vaccine. And I hope that those who are in the hospital right now, I see a few of you are in the hospital, I hope you feel better, and I hope they are treating you well, and we will be praying for you and thinking about you. So we are waiting for the Greater Than COVID account to join. And Greater Than COVID is a project from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and this is a pretty big nonprofit. And the goal of that project is called A Conversation for Us by Us, is to listen to Black providers, Black doctors, Black nurses, Hispanic doctors, Hispanic nurses, about their experience with the vaccines, and to really answer questions, because there are a lot of questions and it matters who the answers are coming from, because, we all have different perspectives on life here. So that is why we have partnered with them, so that we can have a conversation with some of their experts. So we are waiting for Greater Than COVID to join, and then we'll be talking with her. In the meantime, we were live just a second ago, and we were talking about some of the clinical trials. And so I was talking about how I was in the Novavax clinical trial, and what I found to be really special to me was that there were a lot of non-white people there. And that's important, because we know from sickle cell, when you go into medicine, sometimes it feels like you're the only person there, and it feels sometimes like you're judged because you're not the right color. And then when medicine's studied, it's not studied in Black populations. So when you ask that question, how does this work on someone like me, there isn't an answer. So the Novavax vaccine trial that I was in, it was so diverse, which also meant it was a lot of fun. So there were a lot of the researchers were Asian and Black and Hispanic, and I was in a site in Chicago, and it just made for a lot of laughs. Like one of the phlebotomists, she was taking my blood. Her name is Maria, and I told her that she needed to use a butterfly needle, and she insisted up and down that she could draw my blood without a butterfly needle. And I said, Miss Maria, that's not true. You need a different needle. And she said no. And then when it didn't work, the needle she used, and then she used a butterfly needle, she labeled me as spooky. I really enjoyed that. She said she's got the spooky veins. So there's a lot of laughs and a lot of comedy that was happening at that trial, and I contribute that to the diverse group of people that was there. All right. I think we have a request here from Dr. Let's see. True, but it wasn't that she wasn't listening. It's because they were trying to use the supplies from the vaccine trial that was sent to them. And, I think it's kind of,
Yeah.
atypical.
Oh,
Hi, Dr.
hi
Boyd. How
guys.
are
Oh my
you?
gosh. I'm so sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry. The first time I did an Instagram live, I was walking and holding the phone, and then it got dark, and I think we're doing great. How are you today?
Oops, wrong button. I'm doing fine. I feel like this is like the start of those verses where they never start on time. And everyone's like, what are the technical difficulties you can have with Instagram? And now I know all of them. Thank you for
Yes.
having me. I'm excited y'all want to talk about the COVID vaccines.
Yes, thank you for being here. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction because when you are as cool as you, it means that we have to read from paper to talk about you. So I'm going to talk about you in third person too. So we are joined today by Dr. Rhea Boyd. She is a pediatrician, a public health advocate, and a scholar. Are you uncomfortable yet with me reading about you while you're sitting there? She describes the focus of her work as focusing on the relationship between structural racism and equity in health. Dr. Boyd, who's with us today, does both clinical and academic work looking at child and public health impacts of harmful policing practices and policies. Recently, Dr. Boyd has been working with the Kaiser Family Foundation to co-create their ongoing campaign, The Conversation Between Us, About Us, a national initiative to bring information about the COVID-19 vaccines directly to Black communities and other communities of color. So we are so excited that you are talking to us today about the COVID-19 vaccine. And welcome, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. Thanks for jumping on today.
Yeah. So just a quick background, we launched a project called Project SCOVID. And if you look at the logo, it's a capital S and a capital C, and then the very last D, SCD, but it's about COVID vaccines and coronavirus and for people with sickle cell and the sickle cell community. And the reason we launched that is because this community has been hit pretty hard by the pandemic. And research out of University of Wisconsin, for instance, saw that about 6 people who caught COVID in their study with sickle cell disease were dying at 6 times the rate of the general Black population. And we're also seeing that people are getting really, really sick with sickle cell disease if they catch COVID. But the other issue is there isn't a lot of information for us in the sickle cell disease community to be making decisions. And so we launched this account, we launched this project, and we want to talk with experts like you just so that we can gather more information to help the people with sickle cell make an informed decision.
That's so great. I'm so glad you guys are doing this because I think early in the pandemic, there were a lot of concerns actually that COVID would be an illness that was perhaps more severe for patients who have sickle cell. Partly because having respiratory infections, regardless of the cause, when you have sickle cell can lead to really serious complications, as many of you who are tuning in right now or who watch this later probably well understand. And so that's the concern about COVID in general, that patients with sickle cell might have a greater risk for those complications. And so that's why we're also really enthusiastic about making sure patients with sickle cell really understand how safe and effective the COVID vaccines are.
Great. So I figure what we can do today is just ask a few questions and then maybe hear from some of your experiences that you've seen in your work with educating people.
Oh yeah, that sounds great.
Great. So one of the first questions we had is, so we know how sick COVID can make people with sickle cell disease, but people with sickle cell, some of them are still nervous about the side effects of the COVID vaccines because, people with sickle cell already are dealing with either their chronic pain or other medications. Some people don't have spleens. And so they're worried that a vaccine could put them into crisis, or they're worried that it could react with their other medications. So where should they go to find information about the vaccines before they receive one?
So for people who want more information, you're welcome to visit some of the resources that we put together. You can visit www.betweenusaboutus.org. We called it that because it started as a campaign just for Black folks in general, folks who have sickle cell, because we know predominantly Black folks are ones who are affected by sickle cell, and folks who don't, who have other chronic illnesses, who are also concerned about whether this is a safe choice for them. And so we put together some resources that all feature Black healthcare workers, Black scientists who are part of clinical trials, Black doctors, Black nurses, who are just talking about the COVID vaccines and all of the wealth of data we have about them. Since then, over the last month, we also launched a Spanish-speaking side for our Afro-Latinx community and for our Latinx community, so that we also have some resources available in Spanish. So for folks who kind of want to ask very specific questions, common things that come up are about side effects. Women are often concerned about the potential effects to their reproductive health. Spoiler alert, there's no connection between the vaccines and concerns about changing your hormones or your reproductive capacity. There's no relationship between the vaccines and infertility, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so on that website, you can watch just quick 30-second to 1-minute videos to answer your questions from experts across the country.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful resource. And it's also, I think it's a wonderful resource to have it in Spanish. And the videos are put together so well. I watched quite a few myself.
I'm so
So
glad you
another
think that.
question.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, they're great and they're funny. So if you can make COVID vaccine information funny, I think you've done the job well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what we were going for. We feel like when Black folks have this conversation with each other, there's always a little bit of levity. Like, are they trying to
Hmm.
hurt us? Like, tell me the truth. And so we tried to kind of capture the way we talk when we're just talking to each other. And we hope it makes it easier for folks to hear the information.
Yeah, I agree. So we did have another question here, and this question came from one of our friends who has sickle cell. She works with our group as well, and she wants to know how these vaccines are different from other vaccines, like like
Mm.
the flu shot, like vaccines you get when you send your kids to school. So how is this vaccine different from those other ones?
So that's a good question. A couple of things that are different. One of the things that are different is like the vector that the vaccine uses. So every vaccine needs like a platform or kind of maybe like a spaceship that allows it to travel into your body and get into your cells. And the spaceship that it uses to make that trip is different depending on the vaccine. So, for example, there are vaccines that have like a virus that's like inactive virus that they take a portion of because viruses are so good at getting in our cells, and they use that as the spaceship. But this vaccine actually just uses, it's called a lipid nanoparticle. It's just a little fat globule that then gets transported into your cells. And inside that globule is a little message that we call mRNA, which the M in mRNA is messenger. And it literally just tells a recipe for how our cells can recognize the outside of the COVID virus. Those what we call spike proteins, which look, I think, kind of like Bantu knots on the outside of the COVID. So it lets you recognize those Bantu knots. So if you see them again, that your immune system's ready to charge and address it really quickly so that you don't get super sick. So the kind of the spaceship or the vector is a little bit different, and what's inside that messenger RNA is a little bit different than other vaccines. The mRNA platform had been used in trials to create vaccines for the flu, which is a common seasonal vaccine, and in trials to create vaccines for Zika. I don't know if people remember Zika. It was a mosquito-borne illness that is endemic in areas that have lots of mosquitoes and affected pregnant women more than other folks. But anyway, they also used the mRNA platform to develop vaccines for Zika. So it wasn't a brand new platform, but it was one that hadn't been used in mass in an active vaccine the way it is being used now. So that part is new.
Got it. And so some of these vaccines were already being produced, already being studied. So when it became time to try them for COVID or against COVID, there was already the technology there, right?
Exactly. This technology was actually developed over a decade ago, which is
Oh,
why,
wow.
just a small aside, we always want to support the sciences because our tax dollars had already been paying for the development of vaccines for diseases that don't even exist. Sorry,
Hmm.
I live in a city by a train. I know that's a little noisy. But anyway, that's why that technology was just sitting on the shelf for when we were ready. Scientists are developing cures for things that we anticipate might happen because pandemics are a possibility. And even though this year has been devastating, we know it's a possibility going into the future. And so scientists are already preparing for what we might need in that event. And they were already prepared for this one, which is why the development of the COVID vaccines actually started in December, which is December 2020, right when COVID was sequenced and we knew its DNA. That's when we started in the United States and really manufacturers across the world trying to develop a vaccine for it.
Wow, that's really incredible. And that's interesting to see science be able to work that quickly. And I think for some of us in the sickle cell community, it was kind of exciting, but also kind of sad because we we've waited for
Mm.
so long for treatments for sickle cell disease, and we know that when there's enough public interest, then science can speed up and move quickly. So do you think that the public interest and, because COVID was affecting people, so many people, that also helped get these vaccines here so quickly?
Honestly, I think the answer is yes. I think
Yeah,
first I misspoke. I meant December 2019, not December
2019.
2020, which is
Yes,
really recent.
2019. Yep.
December 2019, and then throughout 2020. But I think it's true. We also hear this
Mhm.
from our community who has HIV. You know, why do we have a COVID vaccine and we don't yet have an HIV vaccine? Although we know, you know, scientists have been well underway trying to create those vaccines as well. I absolutely think it was the international burden
Mm-hmm.
of this infection, and how deadly it is, and has been, that created the political will for governments to invest in an unprecedented way, and um, for pharmaceutical companies, who typically are honestly driven by profit margins, to collaborate in ways that they do not usually. Usually they're incredibly competitive. And
Yeah.
the urgency of this moment facing this global plague, I think, drove an enormous investment and enormous collaboration so that we could produce a vaccine truly in record time. It also allowed some of the bureaucratic steps that sometimes delay these processes to be kind of taken away, because we needed this to, once we knew they were safe, we needed people to be able to have access to them as soon as possible. So there were a lot of things that were very unique about this scenario, that created a different type of environment so that we could make it faster.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I also think that we're seeing this effort now for health equity, for equitable changes. And when I
Mm.
was riffing earlier, I was talking about how I'm in a Novavax clinical trial.
Oh,
And
wow.
I saw with my eyes the increase Black and Hispanic people. And I'd never seen this before.
Mm.
So much so that I was joking with the coordinator. I pulled him aside and I said, "Did you schedule all the Black people for Wednesday? Why are there so many of us at this clinical
Um,
trial?" And he said, "No, it's because the manufacturer, the company, prioritized Black people, Hispanic people, people with pre-existing conditions, people that worked in factory, and they were doing things like scheduling appointments super early so people could come before work, or
mm.
sending nurses to the house if you needed medical visits so that you didn't have to leave." So with all of that in mind, what are some lessons I think that you've learned during this pandemic and working with the Black community about education on COVID-19 vaccines?
What you just highlighted is so critical, and I just want to underscore it, that the reason that we don't see communities of color, low income workers, parents who are busy and don't often have time to participate in clinical trials, the reason we are not well reflected in clinical trials isn't because people don't believe in science or people of color don't want to participate in the process. It's because that there are barriers built into the process that essentially exclude people. Things like you shared, like what time do people have to show up to get this thing? If it's between 8 and 5 and you work 9 to 5, how would you do that? You know, if you have a child and you don't have childcare, how would you participate in a clinical trial? And the same things are true, we've learned about the vaccines, that the biggest barrier for communities of color, for Black folks and Spanish speaking populations in particular, wasn't their hesitancy. It wasn't that people don't want the only treatment we have to prevent COVID-19. It's that people don't have good access. At first, there was nowhere to go in your neighborhood to get it. People differently. Um, and so, oops, you froze a little bit. Are you
We're back. Thanks.
here? Okay, perfect. So anyway, the ways that we kind of rolled out the vaccine truly prioritized people who already had great access to healthcare, people who already have healthcare providers who would call them up and say, "Hey, we have it at the clinic that you're used to coming to, come on down." But if you didn't have a healthcare provider, or there was no healthcare center even in your neighborhood, you know, it was unclear in the beginning where you could even get a vaccine. Then the vaccine hours weren't that accessible. And then people had a number of questions. You know, early on, we asked folks like Kaiser Family Foundation and other polling agencies, you know, polled communities to say, would you get the COVID vaccine, before many of the vaccines were even approved? And so, of course, people are like, nah, you know, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
getting that vaccine. I don't know anything about it. And I think that's a reasonable response. And so instead of calling people hesitant, our project has really been focused on the very credible concerns people have. And that, you know, we understand that before anybody gets any medical procedure, you want to understand what the science says about it and what the impact for you might be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's interesting with some of the sickle cell people we work with. So my brother had sickle cell too. You'll find for sickle
Mm.
cell, we have to talk to each other to find information. But you'll also see that we will pull entire packet inserts and read them because it's hard to get information about these new treatments.
Mm,
Exactly what you're saying, it's not necessarily we're hesitant, it's because there isn't information there. So once the information's there,
exactly.
then people will be involved.
Exactly. It's why we're doing events like this. It's why we have partnered with organizations like Unidos and Black Coalition Against COVID, who are also hosting webinars and going into our communities to just have these conversations to say, we know you have questions. That's totally reasonable. We encourage you to ask questions before consenting to a medical procedure. Like, let's
Hmm.
talk about it. Now, we know the information from the clinical trials, but we also know the information that now then more than 150 million Americans have gotten at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. We are collecting constant safety information to better understand what are risks, even exceedingly rare risks, like some of the risks that popped up about Johnson and Johnson, for example.
Hmm. Exactly. And so, do you have any stories that highlight the impact of work that you've been
Hmm.
doing?
This is a great question. Maybe a couple. Early on, we first launched as like a digital platform where people could just go online and go down what we knew would be like a healthy rabbit hole of information. There would be no disinformation trying to mislead you. We would give you sources and websites to click on so you could understand exactly where we got the information that we were sharing with folks. But really quickly, we realized that it wasn't enough, that we also had to go out and make sure proactively that we were fostering these conversations with folks in spaces that they go to. And so some of those most moving spaces we've shown up at have honestly been churches and faith-based communities. Those um, those kind of meetings, I think for me, have been by far the most meaningful. I mean, they often open with a prayer. We have seen folks of all ages, whole families on a screen together, asking questions about grandma or questions about cousins. Um, and people, I think, when they're in that environment, with their pastor leading the questions, feel more comfortable saying the truth. Like, I heard this from so and so. Is that the case? Or I worry about this about myself. Like, are you sure I can do it? And so I feel like just having those more private conversations with a community who's trusted and beloved, like a faith community, has really allowed people to open up. And so I'm glad you guys are having it with your community here on Instagram because I think it lets people, ask their questions.
Ask their questions. Yep. And what are some of the common questions that you're getting?
You asked one to lead off, which is what about the side effects? That is a
Yes.
major concern of people who say they're still waiting to see, which is kind of the group of people that we're trying to go after with information to make sure that you're not waiting because you don't have the information that you need. So a big concern is whether people are going to have side effects and whether those side effects are going to keep them out of work. And so it's important to understand that the different vaccines have different side effect profiles. So for example, for Johnson and Johnson, which is just one shot, it doesn't tend to have many side effects. It doesn't have as many side effects as the mRNA vaccines, which have two shots. That said, the Johnson and Johnson had a major safety signal, and that's why early on in the vaccination process, when I think about 8 million folks had received at least one Johnson and Johnson, that's when they paused it because they saw that among women in particular, and at that time it was about 15 women. So
Hmm.
15 out of 8 million total, which included women and men. So probably 15 out of like a couple 100,000 just women who received it um, had this blood clot side effect, and they paused the whole thing, which I know raised a lot of red flags for people. Like, this is why I'm waiting to see if there's rare side effects. But at the same time, I think it should be really reassuring to people because even with just 15 people, they stopped it and
Yeah.
nobody received it until they were able to look more closely to ensure that it did come from the vaccine and that we knew who was most at risk. And so now women who are young, who are less than age 50, have the choice of discussing with their provider whether the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is for them because that's the population for which we saw that more rare serious side effect. The mRNA vaccines, again, have two doses. It's Moderna and Pfizer. And it's after that second dose commonly that people have side effects that are almost like flu-like symptoms. You feel
Hmm.
fatigued, you have some muscle aches, you might have headache, even some dizziness or pain at your injection site or swollen lymph nodes. Those are the most common ones. Right now, the CDC is reviewing whether young folks who have recently been approved for the vaccine, folks between age 12 and 24, have an increased risk of heart inflammation as a result of receiving an mRNA vaccine. That is also exceedingly rare at this point. They've seen, I think in total, around 800 cases have been reported at this point, but that's out of, the more than 100 million who have received it. So it's very rare, and it's not clear yet that it's coming from the vaccine, but that's why they're also doing an emergency meeting this coming Wednesday or not this Wednesday, Friday on June 18th to determine if they will change the guidelines for young folks. So I say those things to say we are sharing all the information we have about these vaccines. We're not keeping the side effects from people because we want people to know we're watching them super closely. And anytime we see anything that's concerning, we take a moment and then the CDC gathers together and they determine, and the vaccine advisory boards, like basically the national council that sets these recommendations, determines whether it's safe to continue. And so that process will also continue so we know even super rare things.
That's really helpful. And it looks like DJ, I believe, said that that's why they're so hesitant. And so we are talking to a sickle cell group here. And so to put this in a little bit into perspective, it's a good thing that FDA had paused the Johnson & Johnson to look at some of these side effects. And this group here is very familiar with the drug called hydroxyurea. And when hydroxyurea was being studied in babies in 1998, in the early 2000s, they also paused that clinical trial because there was particles in the bottle. And they paused it because they wanted to know if that particle in the bottle was something that could be harmful to the babies on hydroxyurea. And they also paused the trial because a baby died. And they reviewed and they saw that one of the babies had passed away because of the anesthesia from the MRI, and that the particles were actually just like a sugar particle. So for this group listening, it's very common for FDA to pause trials. Hello, trained. And it's a good thing. It's because they are reviewing the safety and making sure that side effects happening in the field, like Dr. Boyd was explaining, are making sure it's still safe and effective for the medication being used.
Exactly. DJ, I'm glad you shared that was your concern. I see your other question about information specifically on sickle cell patients. So as more folks get the vaccines, they're able to then separate out populations that we can better understand how they responded. Right now, we don't have that data for sickle cell patients alone. The data has been, for example, a population they were able to separate out was birthing folks. So folks who are pregnant or expecting. There were concerns early on that, when you're pregnant, that you're immunocompromised. And so that population was concerned about whether they should receive the vaccine. And so the CDC released data a couple of months ago just on pregnant populations who have had the COVID vaccines. We would love it if they would release data on other patient populations, like folks with sickle cell, folks who have other forms of physical impairments. I was just talking to some folks at the CDC who work with folks with disabilities, and they were talking about work that they're hoping to do to release information about folks with disabilities and how they are faring with the COVID vaccines because of potential side effects that might affect their physical abilities, even if it's short term. So we are hoping that data gets released, but we don't have it separated out in that same way, to my knowledge, right now.
And hopefully, if we can look at certain conditions or even looking at blood disorders, we'll be able to have more information and more insight as to how people with sickle cell are reacting. But DJ, also know that we've been talking to people with sickle cell. So if you want to head over to Project SCOVID, you can see some of their stories. And then also the MERAC, the Medical and Advisory Committee, that makes recommendations for people with sickle cell. They're seeing that the most common side effects in people with sickle cell are almost the same as the general population. And they also saw that some people are reporting some sickle pain, but it's not anything that they can't treat at home. So they're able to treat their sickle pain at home. But that would be really interesting, Dr. Boyd, if we could see information about people with sickle cell who do get vaccinated, because that has also been a question that we have been getting quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I think going forward, we will have information like that, and it all may not need to come from the CDC. I think The different researchers, for example, like who study blood diseases, I think will start pulling that information out and publishing it. I think it's just going to take more time, honestly. And right now, time is frankly not on our side in the same way. From what we know at this moment right now is that getting COVID infection is far, far, far more dangerous for patients with sickle cell or patients without than getting the COVID vaccines. And that's true for all of the COVID vaccines, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer. And so it's important for people to understand the risk that our country still is in. Although many of us live in areas that are reopening, where perhaps you don't have mask mandates anymore, if you are unvaccinated, you are still at risk for contracting COVID, and the risk is actually higher now than it was before. And the reason it's higher now is because the initial COVID strains were not as transmissible as the strains now, which means before you might have encountered someone with COVID, but because the virus wasn't as great at infecting people, you might not have gotten it. But now, because the virus is much better at infecting people, your risk every time you encounter someone who has it, especially if they're not masked right now, is higher than it's been throughout the pandemic. So now is honestly a time to seriously consider protecting yourself with one of the COVID vaccines, and talking to your provider perhaps more about which platform might be right for you.
Well, that's incredibly helpful. So we are almost at our time. I don't see many other questions, but Dr. Boyd, we always like to end all of our talks, interviews is what gives you hope about this pandemic? What gives you hope after living through the year that we have all had? How do you remain hopeful in this moment? What gives you hope?
I think a couple of things. One, I think the process by which the vaccines were developed was fast. It was fast and it was different than how vaccines are usually developed. And so I think it was very normal for people to have questions. In the face of those questions, almost half of our nation's population, more than 150 million people, have decided to get vaccinated. And although that still leaves half of us who don't have vaccines, I myself am vaccinated as a healthcare worker, but half of us don't have those vaccines, that 50% says a lot about how many people have trusted in the vaccines. I'll also say we now have data that says 96% of doctors in this country, this is data from the AMA that just came out this week, got a COVID vaccine. If anything, doctors know both the most about how bad COVID can get because we were the folks who were in ICUs and in clinics and emergency rooms taking care of these patients, and we know the most about the COVID vaccines. And so from both of those experiences, almost every doctor in this country has decided to vaccinate themselves. People should take that really seriously. Doctors are doing what they believe will protect themselves, knowing that we are exposed all the time when we go into work. And so I hope those things give you guys hope too, that doctors and half of us as a population have decided to get the vaccine, and the serious side effects that we've seen are exceedingly rare. And we continue to watch it really closely to make sure that, they're not more common. So I hope this gives people some encouragement. And if you have more questions, I love that you guys have Project SCOVID. I think people should definitely check it out. I hope you check out Between Us, About Us, which is a partnership between the Kaiser Family Foundation, Black Coalition Against COVID, and Unidos US, to bring our communities more information about these vaccines.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. Everyone here, make sure to check out the We Are Greater Than COVID account and the Project SCOVID account for stories, for information, and honestly, the We Are Greater Than COVID and the conversation for us by us it's really funny. I was chuckling, laughing, and gave it to my parents to watch. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a lovely, lovely week.
Oh, thank you. You too. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there with our technical difficulties. And then let's get vaccinated.
Let's get vaccinated. Take care.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.